Assad has fallen. After 13 years of a brutal civil war, Islamist rebels have taken control of Damascus. Syrians are returning home en masse, and foreign powers like Israel and Turkey are intervening. We've seen this movie before. An Arab dictator falls and the country descends into chaos. So will Syria be any different? In this video, we're going to explore 3 scenarios. Could Syria end up like Libya or Iraq, devolving into sectarian violence and a renewed civil war? Or maybe like Afghanistan, falling under brutal but centralized Islamist rule? Or perhaps like Arab Spring Tunisia with a new and fragile democracy? Is Syria at the helm of a new dawn or a new nightmare? Find out in this video. The fall of the lion. Al-Assad means the lion in Arabic, and the Assad family have ruled Syria like lions since they first came to power in 1971. First under Hafez al-Assad, and since 2000 under his son Bashar al-Assad. The legacy they left behind is one of tyranny. Prisons filled to the brim with dissidents locked up for years, including little children. Mass graves being uncovered. Secret underground torture chambers, and one man locked up so long he asked if Assad's father was still in charge. So how could a dynastic dictatorship that lasted 53 years fall so suddenly? As recently as 2023, Assad was being welcomed back into the Arab League, and it seemed like he had won the war as the country froze into an uneasy stalemate. Well, there are 2 main factors: foreign support and the economy. When Syrians first rose up against Assad in 2011, his regime very quickly lost control of large parts of the country, and by 2012 he might have fallen had it not been for the direct intervention of Iran and Russia. Syria has been a vital link in Iran's so-called Shia Crescent, forming a direct supply route to its Hezbollah proxy army in Lebanon. To keep Assad in power, in 2012, thousands of Hezbollah fighters were deployed to Syria. Russia also had an interest in the region. Not only does it have a vital air and naval base in Syria, Russia's only military base in the Mediterranean, but Syria offered a unique political opportunity. If it could defend Assad against Western-backed militants, then Putin could demonstrate to other dictators that Russia was a credible alternative alliance partner to the West, and demonstrate the superiority of Russian weapon systems, boosting arms sales. And so in 2015, Russian military intervention began to turn the tide in Assad's favor. It's also worth pointing out the sheer brutality that Assad used against his own people, not hesitating to use carpet bombing on whole cities, starvation, and chemical weapons against civilians. But it worked. By 2020, 2/3 of the country was back under Assad's control, except the east, which remained in the hands of the Kurds, and the north, which remained in the hands of Turkish-backed Islamist rebels. The brutal civil war slowed down to an uneasy stalemate. Slowly, Assad began re-legitimizing himself in the Arab world, and by 2023, he had been readmitted into the Arab League. It seemed as if Assad had won. And this is where the second factor came in. You see, Assad was now a king of ashes. The country had been bombed to ruins, yet any hope of recovery was dashed by US Caesar sanctions. Signed into law by President Trump in 2020, these sanctions not only prevented trade or investment in Syria directly, but also imposed secondary sanctions on any third parties dealing with Syria. This destroyed any hope of an economic recovery or securing loans to rebuild the country. As a result, the Syrian lira collapsed and inflation soared to an all-time high of 188% in 2021. Assad struggled to pay his own demoralized soldiers, let alone rebuild the country. With no sources of revenue, Assad's regime turned the country into a narco state, with Syria producing 80% of the world's captagon, an illicit drug. Yet as the Syrian people suffered, Assad and his allies reaped the fruits of corruption. Line after line of Lamborghinis and other luxury cars were discovered in Assad's palace after his overthrow, a testament to the billions his family looted from the country. Assad's failure to deliver any kind of peace dividend led to renewed protests in 2023, even in areas seemingly under firm government control. In truth, Assad's regime was a house of cards that only appeared stable because it was being propped up by foreign powers. And then, Ukraine happened. The Russian military support keeping Assad in power was transferred to the Ukrainian battlefront. This would have been manageable had it not been for the outbreak of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict the following year. Iran's resources and attention were diverted to Gaza and Lebanon, while the thousands of Hezbollah fighters that had been propping up Assad were transferred back to Lebanon to fight Israel. And then, in one fell swoop, Israel decapitated most of the leadership of Hezbollah and knocked out its fighting capacity. Assad was now on his own, and so sensing the opportunity, Syria's rebel factions launched a massive strike. The rebels had only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure came crumbling down. Unwilling to keep fighting for their dictator, and with no foreign backing, Assad's army melted away, clearing the path for the rebels to seize control of the capital. And so Assad had no choice but to flee to his patrons in Moscow. And the Syria that Assad left behind is devastated. 6.7 million people forced to flee as refugees, another 6.6 million internally displaced, 150,000 missing, and over 600,000 dead. So what happens now? Libya 2.0. Libya and Iraq provide cautionary tales of what can happen when Middle Eastern regimes are toppled. Much like in Syria, the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein was met with celebrations in Libya and Iraq, but very quickly both countries fell into chaos as competing rebel factions vied for control in the ensuing power vacuum. This led to civil wars, and neither countries have recovered the same levels of stability or economic prosperity. So what's the situation in Syria? Well, we first have to understand the political and sectarian balance. This is a political map of Syria. Syria now has three main competing rebel factions. The most powerful rebel faction, which has taken control of the capital Damascus and set up a transitional government, is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, led by Ahmed al-Sharaa, who adopted the nom de guerre Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. HTS is a direct offshoot of Al-Nusra Front, a militant group with links to Al-Qaeda, and al-Sharaa is on the terrorist list of multiple countries with a $10 million bounty on his head. Now, since they split from Al-Qaeda, they claim to have moderated, but that remains to be seen. More on that later. The Syrian National Army, the SNA, a coalition of rebel groups backed by Turkey, controls the north, while the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, a pro-Kurdish group, controls the east. On top of that, foreign powers also control territory, with the Turkish army in control of northern border regions, while Israeli forces have begun moving in from the south. At the same time, the United States maintains a military base in the southeast, where yet another rebel group, the Free Syrian Army, mostly secular defectors from Assad's military, also have a presence. However, the Free Syrian Army and smaller groups of southern rebels have both declared their loyalty to HTS's new government. Now, overlay the three-way political divide onto an ethno-religious map of Syria. The majority, around 60%, are Sunni Arabs. In the west of the country, you have the Alawites, a divergent sect of Shia Islam, and Assad's former power base at 10%. In the northeast are the Kurds, who are also Sunni Muslims, but not Arabs, at 9%. In the southwest, you have the Druze, an ethno-religious group combining elements of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, at 3%. There are also large pockets of Christians, especially in the west and in urban areas, at 10%. And on top of that, there are about a dozen other ethnic and religious minorities, from Armenians to non-Alawite Shias and Yazidis. So for there to be peace in Syria, for it not to become a Libya 2.0, these various ethno-religious sects and competing militant groups have to somehow work together to share power and form a transitional government. Now, there are some good signs. The leader of HTS has appointed Mohammed al-Bashir to continue as prime minister and head up a transitional government until March 2025. The prime minister also said that there will be a new constitution, elections, and that war criminals from Assad's regime will be prosecuted. But of course, real power is with HTS, which is a group with Islamist or even jihadist origins. Yet over the last few years, HTS has put a lot of effort to rebrand itself as a more tolerant force capable of governing a modern country. Whether this transformation is genuine or pragmatic, it's clear that HTS is aiming to form a stable government, but it might not all be in their hands. In Libya, much of the infighting that broke out after the fall of Gaddafi has been fueled and kept ablaze by foreign hands. In the case of Syria, those hands are Turkish, Israeli, Iranian, Russian, and American. Already we're seeing infighting between the Turkish-backed SNA and the Kurdish SDA in the east of the country. For years now, Turkey has been backing the SNA and has even deployed its own troops in Syria's border regions, mainly for two reasons. Turkey hosts over 4 million Syrian refugees. Erdogan wants the return of Syrian refugees, especially as anti-immigrant sentiment is rising in Turkey, hurting his own popularity. In the last election, the opposition campaigned on mass deportations. The second reason is much more fundamental. Turkey wants to stop Kurdish separatism. Turkey has its own large Kurdish minority and has been fighting the PKK, a Kurdish separatist group with Marxist leanings, for decades. The PKK is considered a terrorist organization and has direct links with the Syrian Democratic Forces. Erdogan cannot allow a Kurdish army or an autonomous Kurdish state to exist on Turkey's border, and so he will push for his proxies in Syria to go to war and take over the Kurdish areas. And that's already happening. Turkish-backed rebels have begun fighting the Kurds in eastern Syria, which could plunge the country into another civil war. Now, the Kurds were previously backed by the United States as they were fighting ISIS, but if America has to choose between Turks and Kurds, they will always choose Turks. Turkey is a NATO member, has one of the most powerful militaries in the alliance, and occupies a strategic position between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, allowing it to block the Russian Navy. Sadly, for the Kurds, the US will never give that up just to support some rebels. And Trump has already indicated that he will not back the Kurds. And then there are the Alawites. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein ran an ostensibly secular regime that in reality favored minority Sunni Arabs for top political positions. When Saddam was overthrown, the new Shia-majority government began marginalizing the Sunnis. At the same time, US Viceroy Paul Bremer made the disastrous mistake of firing all military officials previously affiliated with Saddam's regime. Suddenly, you had a bunch of angry Sunni men with military experience and nothing to lose, which ultimately led to a Sunni uprising and the rise of ISIS. Something similar could happen in Syria. Assad ran an ostensibly secular regime that in practice favored Alawites for the top political positions. It goes without saying that many Alawites did not support Assad or benefit from his regime. But that doesn't change the fact that the majority of top military and political officials in Assad's government were Alawites, and as a result, there could be lingering resentments against the Alawite population as a whole. Couple that with the pre-existing prejudice that Alawites aren't real Muslims, and you have a recipe for a dangerous reprisal against a now disempowered minority group. If the new Sunni Islamist HTS government were to begin repressing the Shia and the Alawites, it could lead to an Alawite uprising in the west of the country, where Alawites are the majority. In fact, footage of an attack against an Alawite shrine sparked massive protests in the Alawite-dominated west, causing the HTS government to send more troops to the region. While HTS condemned the attack, it shows that tensions are high. Tensions that can be exploited. As the biggest loser in this conflict, Iran has lost all leverage in Syria. They just lost one of their staunchest allies in the Middle East, and the land route supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon is cut off. The Shia crescent is broken. But a campaign of repression against Alawites and Shia would give Iran an opportunity to regain that leverage. The involvement of former regime loyalists and resources from Iran could make such a rebellion that much more potent. Now, HTS has declared that it intends to protect the rights of minorities, but if it doesn't, it could well facilitate an Alawite counter-revolution. And then there's Israel. Israel has already occupied a small southwestern corner of Syria called the Golan Heights since the 1967 Six-Day War. Yet the moment Assad fell, it began moving its forces over the line of control to take over positions abandoned by Assad's army. Israel's strategy is complex. Assad, as a close ally of Iran and Hezbollah, was an enemy of Israel, and Israel frequently performed airstrikes to the benefit of the rebels. But during the civil war, Assad was too weak to pose any real threat to Israel. But now that he's gone, rebels with the radical Islamist sympathies are taking over the country. Israel fears that they will gain access to the weapons caches of the Assad army, and so it's preemptively destroying them before they get into the hands of the rebels. And Israel has no intention of pulling back for the foreseeable future. Last time they temporarily intervened in Lebanon, they stayed for almost 20 years. So in a very likely scenario, infighting between rebel groups, an uprising by regime loyalists, and foreign intervention could all turn Syria into another Libya. But it could also end up under more stable authoritarian rule. Taliban in the Levant. The collapse of Assad's regime in Syria has many parallels to the collapse of the US-backed government in Afghanistan. In both cases, long-standing civil wars ended very quickly as regime forces suddenly gave up, allowing the Taliban in Afghanistan and HTS in Syria to quickly take over. In Afghanistan, the Taliban takeover did not lead to a new civil war, but instead to peace. That is, peace under authoritarian Islamist rule. The strictest interpretation of Islam was implemented, with women being stripped of their rights and excluded from public life. In turn, the Taliban government has had difficulty establishing international legitimacy. Virtually no country officially recognizes its government. The Afghan central bank reserves are still frozen, sanctions are in place, and foreign aid is restricted. All this has facilitated a total economic collapse in the country and a renewed wave of refugees. That is to say, even if HTS were to establish a monopoly of power across all of Syria, if it goes the Taliban route of extreme Islamism or even supporting global jihadism, it can expect international isolation and economic collapse in return. HTS's leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, clearly recognizes this threat and has adopted a much more conciliatory and pragmatic approach. Keeping Assad's prime minister and other technocrats in power to head the transitional government has been a smart move. Not only does this keep the Syrian state somewhat intact, it also positions HTS as the most legitimate actor to take power in Syria and secure international recognition. On top of that, by keeping former regime loyalists on his side, al-Sharaa prevents what happened in Iraq, where regime loyalists helped fuel an uprising. HTS has also promised that they will protect minorities and not introduce clothing restrictions for women. In Idlib, where HTS was in power for several years, they did not introduce draconian Islamist measures and ran a relatively inclusive government, although it was by no means democratic. They still locked up political opponents. Similarly, in Aleppo, the city's Christians were allowed to worship freely. These are all good signs that point against a Taliban-style takeover. But we heard similar things from the Taliban when they promised to form an inclusive government and respect women's rights. Yet 3 years on, the oppression of women is worse than it's ever been. HTS could simply be playing moderate in order to legitimize themselves as a new government in the eyes of the international community and secure their rise to power. Once their power is secure, the mask could slip. But maybe it doesn't matter if HTS is being genuine or not. You see, while the Taliban pretended to have moderated when securing power, it did this also for pragmatic reasons, namely to secure international legitimacy and access to the resources of the previous government. But it never got these. The US continues to keep the over $10 billion in Afghan central bank reserves frozen, so the Taliban simply returned to their old ways. But had the US made returning some of these assets to the government conditional on forming an inclusive government or respecting at least some human rights protections and cutting off funding if the Taliban ever broke the deal, they could have actually incentivized them to moderate. The same could be true in Syria. Al-Sharaa clearly wants international recognition and the resources he needs to rebuild Syria. And unlike the Taliban, HTS is in a much weaker position because it still has to contend with rival rebel factions. The United States and the international community can incentivize HTS to form a more moderate and inclusive government by making recognition, the lifting of sanctions, and the granting of aid and reconstruction loans conditional on these kinds of reforms. No, it doesn't mean that Syria is going to become Switzerland, but the worst Islamist tendencies and the marginalization of Syria's Christians, Kurds and Alawites and other minorities could be prevented this way. But the opposite could happen if we don't. President-elect Trump has declared that he wants nothing to do with Syria. While Trump is right in the sense that military involvement is not necessary or desirable for America, pretending that ignoring Syria will not in some way affect the US or its allies is wrong. If HTS's conciliatory overtures are rejected, the radical elements within that organization will be empowered. Why would they moderate if it gains them nothing? Preventing a Taliban in the Levant is possible and desirable for the West. The alternative is a country run by jihadists, exporting terrorism and millions more refugees. But is there a hopeful scenario for Syria? Syrian Dawn. The roads are jam-packed. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees are pouring over the Turkish and Lebanese border back into Syria, back home. While the possibility that Syria descends into chaos is very real, Syrians seem to be optimistic for now. For a more positive example of what a peaceful transition can look like, we can look at the country where the Arab Spring originally started, Tunisia. After the fall of dictator Ben Ali in 2011, various opposition forces united to form a transitional government and write a new constitution. One of the key players was the Ennahda movement, an Islamist political party which went on to become the single largest party in Tunisia, although it never won a majority. While Ennahda was Islamist, it significantly moderated its positions from its roots, eventually looking more like a Muslim version of a conservative Christian Democratic Party than something like the Taliban. The constitution established in Tunisia represented a compromise between Islamist and secular forces in the country. For instance, it simultaneously made Islam the official religion, but also guaranteed full religious freedom and a secular government. Now, Tunisia did eventually end up back under one-man rule when Kais Saied seized power in 2021 in the wake of economic frustration. But Tunisia's democracy did last 10 years and had multiple peaceful changes of power between Islamist and secular parties. Ultimately, it was the failure of the economy, mainly due to external forces, that undermined its democracy, not the actions of Islamist parties. What would be needed for stability and democracy in Syria? The answer is an inclusive government and a negotiated peace, together with international support for reconstruction. None of the rebel groups in Syria are strong enough to hold unilateral power in the country. If any of them tried, it would plunge the country back into full-blown civil war. After 13 years of non-stop violence, nobody can afford that. Even if the rebels aren't the Democrats or moderates they present themselves as, it's in their own interests to create an inclusive government to prevent sectarian conflict. Ennahda recognized this. Not everyone in Tunisia wanted an Islamist government, and so they had to compromise and share power. The initial moves to form a transitional government seem positive. To prevent further infighting, all rebel factions, Islamist, Kurdish, and secular, as well as civil society actors, need to be invited into some kind of government of national unity. At the same time, the new power brokers must reject the designs of foreign powers. Instigating a war with the Kurds can only benefit Turkey, not Syria. The best solution is to offer the Kurds some kind of regional autonomy, just like in Iraq, where the Kurds have their own regional government. At the same time, the Kurdish SDA needs to cut all ties to the PKK and integrate its forces into a national army. The Kurds will have to accept this, as they know no country, least of all Turkey, will accept an autonomous Kurdish state. While war criminals from Assad's regime should be hunted down and punished, reprisals against the Alawite population as a whole will only sow the seeds for a future rebellion and open the gates to Iranian intervention. All minorities, Alawites, Kurds, Christians, Druze, should be included in the government. Forming a radical Islamist government like that in Afghanistan might align with the desires of radical Islamist factions, but not with that of most Syrians. Syria isn't Afghanistan. It's much more modern and developed, and its population too diverse to impose a narrow version of strict Islamic law. The government must commit to a secular form of government. Rejecting radicalism will also help the power brokers to gain international legitimacy, which they need to get the international aid and economic support to rebuild the country. No nation wants to support a Syria that is a hotbed of jihadists. The alternative is ending up like Afghanistan, where all international aid was pulled, economic sanctions were imposed, and the economy collapsed as the country descended into isolationism. The HTS-dominated transitional government has made moves in this direction, pledging to disband the various rebel militias to form a single national army, meeting with leaders from the Christian and Druze communities, with hundreds of thousands of Syrian Christians openly celebrating Christmas this year. During those same Christmas celebrations, a Christmas tree was burned down, sparking massive protests from Christians. Now, HTS did respond quickly, replacing the Christmas tree and condemning the perpetrators. At the same time, however, the transitional government has appointed 14 ministers, every single one HTS affiliated, which doesn't exactly point towards political inclusivity. To help facilitate a peaceful transition, international players, including President Trump, need to be open to the new Syrian transitional government and start negotiating, putting recognition, the lifting of sanctions, and economic aid on the table to incentivize their moderation. There are some good signs already. Qatar and Turkey have reopened their embassies for the first time in 13 years. Officials from Western countries are meeting with the new HTS-dominated government, and the outgoing Biden administration has lifted the $10 million bounty on al-Sharar's head. While Trump's isolationist tendencies and Israel's expansionist aims could make this more difficult, there is a possible solution. Trump is staunchly pro-Israel, is interested in pulling out of the Middle East, and made the Abraham Accords, in which Arab states recognized Israel, one of the cornerstones of his foreign policy. Syria under Assad was one of the most pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel states in the Arab world. That could change if Trump could make a deal with the new government. Land for peace. In 1978, during the Camp David Accords, Egypt recognized Israel in exchange for the return of the occupied Sinai region. Trump could facilitate a similar deal. Israel withdraws from the newly occupied territories, and maybe even the Golan Heights. The US withdraws from Syria, recognizes the new government and lifts sanctions, in exchange for Syria recognizing Israel. The Golan Heights could be a tough sell for Israel, which has already annexed the region and announced the renewed expansion of illegal settlements into the region. But al-Sharar, HTS's leader, might demand it. Not only would the return of the Golan Heights massively boost his legitimacy and therefore his power within Syria, he himself is from a family displaced from the Golan Heights when Israel invaded. That's why he chose the name al-Jolani. But even without the Golan Heights, a Syrian government desperate for recognition and economic aid might still take the deal. Syria needs to form an inclusive government and establish a constitution in line with the desires of the Syrian people, while rejecting the designs of foreign power players. This is not just in the interests of the Syrian people, but also of leaders like al-Sharar. After all, it is better to be a king of gold than a king of ashes. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and consider becoming a Patreon to support the channel. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.